Several times here on the channel I've talked about the demographic crisis, but what exactly is that, and why are only a few people realizing that this will be humanity's greatest crisis? That's what I want to explore with you today. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, or join one of our social networks to stay up to date with the channel's news on Instagram, Telegram, or Twitter. My name is Geopolitica Mundial, and this is the Geopolitica Mundial channel. The first thing you need to understand is that the demographic crisis is not just about a low birth rate, because we've had societies with low birth rates in the past and there wasn't a major collapse because of it. We've also had historical periods of population decline that were far from leading to collapse. Let's say they caused such a big mess in society and in the institutions that the post-decline reconstruction period led to a new geopolitical design, which led humanity to more progress than ever before. An example of this was the Black Death, which wiped out up to a third of human life in Europe. So that wouldn't be the demographic crisis. It's actually the sum of two things, at least in a more superficial sense. First, the drop in birth rates, and that combined with the sharp increase in the aging of society. So birth rate crises are nothing new. But demographic crises are something humanity will face for the first time in history. Because look, when we had drops in birth rates, it was usually due to pandemics, wars, economic crises, famine, or things like that. In other words, birth rates would drop, but that's because overall mortality would rise. Especially among children and the elderly, who are the two most vulnerable human groups, since they are biologically more vulnerable. But the drop in birth rates without the population dying is something new. I already explained this in another video here, how the generation of baby boomers, those people born between 1945 and 1964, literally condemned humanity for at least 6 or 7 generations with wrong measures that reduced wealth production while tying up the budget for at least a century. This is undoubtedly one of the factors that has destined 21st century humanity to be a much more suffering humanity. And it has directly impacted the birth rate. But there's much more to it than that. That's why I find it funny when someone comes up with a magic solution for this. For this birth rate problem, just saying that lowering the cost of living would be enough. As if lowering the cost of living by itself wasn't already something very difficult. And even if it was something easy, there are many more things involved. And I think this is where most people don't understand the magnitude of the blow this crisis will be. Because there isn't an easy solution, since there are several reasons that led to this. And since we've never dealt with this before, we don't have a parallel for it, to know what to do or not to do. We're groping in the dark. But the demographic crisis will be the biggest problem in the history of humanity, because it's not just about that, even if it were only that. It would already be a colossal problem, but it's actually because it's a trigger that will cause a series of other crises to happen, precisely because of the demographic crisis. It would be like a kind of domino piece or a house of cards falling. Choose the analogy that makes the most sense to you, because this crisis, which on its own is already very serious, is precisely the turning point for several other crises that will result from it. But what really impresses and worries me the most by far is how the vast majority of the population doesn't think this will be a problem. In fact, in some cases, it's even worse. They think this could actually save the world. The media recently made a big deal about how India surpassed China in population, with the Chinese being the nation that would age the fastest in the world, and that was enough for the anti-China crowd to immediately predict the end of China. But what the media didn't show was this chart of how, contrary to expectations, the population growth of the United States is almost 0%. In other words, almost no growth at all. And I say this because recently some studies hypothetically showed how the North American population would keep growing for the rest of the century, and that by the end of the 21st century, it might even surpass China, since China's population would shrink while the United States would only keep rising. But that's far from the case, because these levels have never been seen in more than 100 years of American history, not even during the post-Great Depression period, when population growth hit a low of about 0.5%. And it's also surprising how some people think that because of this, the situation there must be worse than here, which isn't true. Because if you look at the population projection that Instituto Brasileiro de Geografia e Estatística had in 2013, it was that in 2023 we would have 216 million people. In fact, in 2020, some news agencies were saying that we had already surpassed 211 million people. But now we see that in 2022 we only reached 203 million people. That's far from what was expected, and really far, which shows that the drop in the birth rate is much faster than we thought here. And if before it was believed that the Brazilian population would start to decline in 2045, now some leaders are talking about 2030. I had already mentioned this in the past in at least 2 or 3 videos here on the channel, where I said that the population would probably start to decline well before 2045, but at the time I guessed 2040. But I was wrong, because the situation from what it seems is even worse than I thought. And with every case we look at, it gets worse. Every 2 years, for example, Japan loses 1 million Japanese people. The average age in Italy has already reached 48 years, so it's a serious situation wherever we look. For hundreds of thousands of years, the human population has had 4 population booms, each one coming after a technological singularity. One with fire, then with agriculture, then with writing, and then with the Industrial Revolution. The last one was the most impressive because it accomplished in 200 years what the others took much longer to do. Here, exponential progress led to exponential growth, raising our numbers from 6 billion people in 1999 to 8 billion in just 24 years. From here, the situation then became more complicated because for a stable population, each couple needs to have an average of 2 children. If the number is higher, the population grows. If it's lower, it decreases. If it's much lower, it shrinks a lot and quickly. In South Korea, for example, the fertility rate was 0.8 children per woman in 2022, the lowest in the world. This means that 100 South Koreans of childbearing age today will have 40 children, and if nothing changes in 100 years, there will be 94% fewer young people in South Korea. The more optimistic people are generally mistaken in thinking that this wouldn't be so bad because we would go back to the population we had in the past. After all, in 1950 there were 20 million South Koreans, and in 2100 it would supposedly be 24 million again. But the point here is that it's not just about the population size, but the quality of the population's composition. In 1950, the average age in South Korea was 18 years old, in 2022 it was 45, and in 2100 it will be 59 years old, practically a country of elderly people. However, regarding China, people usually attribute the low birth rate in China to the one-child policy, which isn't exactly true, as you can see in the chart. The fertility rate in China had already been declining long before the one-child policy. After all, the Chinese had already gone through the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, major food crises, and so on. The one-child policy only prevented the low fertility rate from recovering, meaning it is only partially responsible. Especially because from the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s onward, the development of Chinese society itself did what happened in other countries. It kept the birth rate low. And in 2016 they reversed that, allowing families to have more than one child. But what they discovered is that not having children wasn't just a matter of laws, but that there was a whole context behind it. So allowing people to have 2, 3, 4 or more children didn't make a difference because statistically, women will simply have fewer than one child regardless of whether the government allows it or not. But the point is that within 4 generations, 100 young Chinese will become 20. China's fertility rates are now among the lowest in East Asia, even lower than those of Japan. So, if the situation in Asia is bad, the truth is that it could be even worse, because in comparison, the decline in Europe seems much slower despite low fertility. But that's because, unlike Asian countries, most European countries, especially in the West, have received an explosive influx of immigrants. So, for those who only deal with numbers on paper, it seems like this was a good idea because it solved the problem, but the truth is that it made things worse because a large part of the immigrants already come from other areas with low fertility rates. The number of immigrant women who have many children is still not high enough to ease fertility rates. That is, a considerable portion of immigrants also end up experiencing a decline in birth rates. But the problem is the other part, which, despite showing a decline in birth rates, at least keeps it at a high enough number to slow down the population decline. This would be good if we weren't talking about just any type of immigrant. This is where the Europeans erred. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi was the dictator of Libya, and it doesn't matter if you liked him or not, or if you supported his dictatorship or not, because that's not the point. The point is that, for better or worse, he had a role. He, just like Saddam Hussein in Iraq almost a decade earlier, contained Islamic extremism from Al-Qaeda and other even more radical groups like the Islamic State. And in the case of Gaddafi, he had an extra factor because he contained illegal African immigration to southern Europe. But in 2011, Sarkozy, the president of France, pressuring his NATO allies, then decided to bomb him, and after several months, they managed to kill him. And as a consequence, with the big and evil cat out of the game, the mice started to have a party. Libya fell, divided by extremely radical Islamic groups, whose only thing in common was their extremely intense hatred for the West. And with that, the route for illegal African immigrants was not only open, but it also became very profitable for these groups. And what we saw was literally an invasion across the Mediterranean Sea. In Syria, the situation with Bashar al-Assad would have been the same, but it wasn't worse only because, with the support of Iran and Russia, he managed to stay in power. But even so, the eastern part of the country collapsed, and the border area with Iraq also fell into the hands of extremist groups, which generated a new wave of Islamic immigrants from the Middle East who, from Turkey, also flooded into Europe. And that's because Turkey still blocked part of that wave. At the time, European leaders like Merkel in Germany, Sarkozy in France, Cameron in England, as well as most leaders of Western Europe, began to celebrate that this would be the end of Europe's low birth rate. After all those immigrants were potential engineers and doctors. Some people even celebrated that now Europe would be better because it would be more multi-ethnic and multicultural. But what we've seen in 10 years is that this was the greatest European tragedy since the end of World War II. This young workforce did not boost European industry, especially because a huge part of them live off social benefits, meaning they only increase the state's debt, which was already extremely high in Europe. And on top of that, they carried with them hatred against European culture and the native white population, bringing scenes of crime, racial and religious violence, social degradation, and political tensions that had never been seen in Europe before. Uncontrolled immigration made what was already bad even worse, because now, as the native population was aging, the anti-Western immigrant population was increasing, and no one knows how long it will take to reach a breaking point, which seems to be very close. The Swedish case is the most emblematic because it used to be the most orderly and developed society with the most privileges in Europe, and now it has neighborhoods where the police can't even enter. Besides that, there was the myth that the demographic issue was only a problem in developed countries, but in Latin America, the replacement rate already became negative in 2015. But there's a problem. The vast majority of Latin American countries, including Brazil, don't have the infrastructure, technology, standard of living, healthcare, or education that Asian or European countries have. In other words, they're getting old before they become rich and developed. Of course, there are still places in the world where fertility rates haven't dropped below replacement level, like much of the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, but on the other hand, these regions can't sustain the size of their populations. And as we see the phenomenon of deglobalization, these regions will become highly vulnerable and are likely to face catastrophic events even though they have young populations. And even there, incredibly, the birth rate is also falling faster than expected. It's still high, but it's dropping quickly. So eventually it will be affected there too and will go through this crisis just a little later than the rest of the planet. But the issue of this demographic crisis is important because for a functional society, you need a sufficient number of people in their working years, that is, at the peak of their physical and mental capacity. Young and middle-aged people do most of the work. In any economic system, people of working age create the wealth of a society. In retirement, in the vast majority of cases, you stop contributing to the economy. And that's precisely when most healthcare costs are generated by the elderly. Throughout all of human history, there were many young people taking care of a few elderly. But in a society where most people are over 60 years old, the young will have to take care of the elderly, generate wealth to support them, and on top of that, they'll still have to think about having children. That doesn't add up. But as the baby boomers started retiring between the 1990s and 2020, they passed budgetary and regulatory laws that require the elderly to have priority in almost everything, including being supported by their children. So, young people will have to choose between having children or taking care of the elderly, either directly or indirectly, since the generation of wealth nowadays is much lower than it was during the baby boomer period. So, the elderly, with a few exceptions, end up being the economic priority for both society and the state, because children are still going to be born, but the elderly are already here. So this creates an effect where, in most average families, the priority becomes taking care of the elderly who already exist, rather than raising new children who do not yet exist. And with society and the state increasingly focused on the elderly instead of having children, you end up with a self-perpetuating cycle, because more and more young people will have fewer children, and there will be fewer and fewer young people to take care of the elderly, who will increasingly make up the majority of the population and require more direct or indirect care. And even if the retirement rules are changed so that people can work much longer, this will only apply to the generations after the baby boomers. In other words, the very people who created this situation won't be affected, since they're already protected from any changes. We will still have to deal with the explosion of healthcare costs, while states with ever-decreasing revenues struggle to keep up with ever-increasing expenses. Technology enthusiasts, as well as those who believe in robotics and artificial intelligence, are betting everything on them to soften this blow. But no matter how much these technologies advance, they will never be able to fully make up for it. So, we're talking about a collapse of healthcare costs worldwide between 2030 and 2060 at least, with most states already at the limits of public debt. In addition, we're saying that with the lack of young labor that generates wealth, there will be a lack of labor that won't generate wealth, but is vital to keep the country's infrastructure functioning. We're talking about extremely high levels of shortage of professionals who do basic maintenance of sewage systems, basic sanitation, the power grid, building and house structures, repairs on roads, railways, ports, airports, and so on. Because infrastructure works on a large scale, and even if its use decreases, it won't get any cheaper because of that. So, if a population decreases or if the income power of that population drops, whether because of the loss of industry or jobs, when people and their incomes disappear, the resources needed to sustain that infrastructure disappear as well. And before you think this is an exaggeration, we already have empirical examples to prove that this would be inevitable. Because we're already seeing this in many depopulated cities or cities that are emptying out, and in countries that have a high technological level of robotization and artificial intelligence like the United States, Germany, and even Japan, some people still argue that if the workforce decreases, automated production would make up for this shortage, but there's a problem with that from an economic and political standpoint. In a society with more elderly people, we're talking about more people who depend on retirement. And retirement, guess what, comes from the government's coffers. And even private retirement is regulated and controlled by the government. And they, the governments, will then have much more control over most people's income than they have today. So we will see democracies melt away because in a society where there is no freedom to build your own wealth, the result is increasingly authoritarian governments. And by prioritizing the maintenance of this system, old banks and long-term planning will increasingly be left aside, which will greatly affect the very technological innovation that technology enthusiasts are betting on to solve this problem. Many people think that having fewer humans on Earth is a good thing because our societies would be unsustainable with so much consumerism and so many people in the world, but the problem is that even if you have fewer humans, as I just said, there will be a lack of maintenance of basic infrastructure. So, actually we will have more waste and more pollution because so-called cleaner societies need more maintenance to ensure this ecological efficiency. We will have a lot more dumping and illegal landfills in several countries around the world. So the environmental impacts of this society will actually be even greater than those we have today. We will have more and more degraded and possibly abandoned buildings in large urban centers, which will damage the environment even more. And since we will have more and more of these vacant properties in large cities, take the city of Detroit in the United States as an example, we can expect a sharp increase in urban crime. Especially because in a state on the verge of fiscal collapse to support the elderly, public security will be at the limit of human and budgetary saturation. Any real estate bubble we've seen so far will end up being small compared to this one, which will be the mother of all real estate crises. So we're talking about a combination of crises that will erupt within the same time frame. Food crises, public government debt crises, industrial crises, public security crises, real estate crises, credit crises, energy crisis, cultural, religious, and ethnic crises in countries with high immigration rates, environmental crises, infrastructure breakdown, inflationary crisis suddenly shifting to deflationary crisis, historic income concentration, and as a consequence, deglobalization. All of this in volumes never seen before and at the same time erupting within the same range of 30 to 60 years at the very least. It is in a historical moment that we have biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons capable of eradicating life on Earth. And not to mention an artificial intelligence that threatens in the future to generate a wave of unemployment never imagined, not even by the most pessimistic people. The war in Ukraine, Armenia, Palestine, the little talked about humanitarian crisis in Sudan, South Sudan, and Chad, or the security instability in Mexico, Ecuador, and South Africa are just the first elements that are becoming noticeable in this process that is only beginning. We can expect more crises in the coming years. Right away, I suggest we keep an eye on Pakistan, the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, Georgia, Central and West Africa, which are the places where there are clearer signs of imminent crises. But there are others that are still off my radar and that we will see popping up like popcorn ahead. But then this brings us to a question. Are we finally reaching the end of the human race? And maybe the answer to that is right in front of us. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, a Russian physicist in 1933, and later Enrico Fermi, an Italian physicist in 1955, asked themselves, in such a vast and ancient universe, why is there only silence? Why haven't we seen or heard from other extraterrestrial civilizations? After all, since the invention of the radio in the 19th century, in theory we should be picking up floods of communication waves from older civilizations, shouldn't we? But that's not the case, there's only silence. Fermi came up with several explanations, but one of them, which is the one we're interested in for now, is the Great Filter Theory, which was introduced by Robin Hanson, an economist, in 1996. It implies that maybe there's something that can act as a barrier to the evolution of intelligent life, or as a high probability of self-destruction, and maybe such an event that filters intelligent life is still ahead of us. This thing could be something natural or caused by the intelligent species itself, so we may be facing three scenarios. The first one is extinction, where we don't make it through this filter and we become an echo in an abandoned world. The second is stagnation, where we won't go extinct right now, but will continue without advancing much beyond where we are today technologically. However, even this option also leads to our extinction because we know that eventually some natural event, either internal or external to the planet, will fall upon us. In fact, even the planet itself has its own lifespan, so we won't escape our fate in this case, which would be destruction. But there is a third scenario, which is that we surpass this filter and become a civilization capable of leaving the planet. If we do that, then there really won't be anything that could lead to the extinction of our species. Because we are at a crossroads of accelerated changes, unlike anything that has ever been seen in the history of life on this planet. It seems that the future could go in any of these three directions as soon as we decide. Humanity is well acquainted with catastrophes as well as near-total extinction events. Our ancestors survived meteor impacts and eras of climate change that almost brought humanity to total collapse, and with far fewer resources than we have today. Approximately 900,000 years ago, humanity faced rapid and drastic climate changes that caused the global human population to drop to fewer than 1,300 individuals capable of reproduction. But today, besides natural threats, there's a difference. We ourselves, since the emergence of nuclear weapons, the threats of self-destruction have come to surpass the risks of all other forms of destruction. The risk of causing our own extinction is more than 300 times greater than extinction by natural causes. The Life Institute identifies four main risks to our existence: nuclear war, climate change, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence. If a full-scale nuclear war happened, besides the destroyed areas and the spread of radioactivity across most of the planet, we would still have global temperatures that could drop by 10 degrees and wipe out up to 63% of the population remaining after the conflict. Nuclear weapons threw tens of thousands of years of military strategy out the window. So, pay attention, because always throughout the history of humanity and war, the combination of military strength was whoever had more soldiers, more equipment, and better commanders. But since the advent of nuclear weapons, everything has changed drastically. Now, if your country has just 10,000 soldiers, a few planes and tanks, and inexperienced commanders, But you have nuclear weapons, none of that matters, because you can still speak as an equal with a country that has millions and millions of soldiers, thousands of planes and tanks, and the best commanders. We have had to, in 70 years, learn a new military and diplomatic logic that was never applied in those thousands of previous years. So we don't know how long it will take until someone makes a wrong decision, and regarding biotechnology, it can be a blessing in solving major crises like food shortages and diseases, but it can also cause a global disaster with a lethal pathogen designed as a biological weapon that could have a death toll vastly greater than a global nuclear war. But the researchers at this institute believe that the greatest threat will be artificial intelligence. Not the current chat generative pre-trained transformer or BARD, but what will come from this in the next decades. Because in this case, we're talking about an intelligent threat, in fact, much more intelligent than us. If the theory of technological singularity that I've already mentioned here on the channel happens in a malignant way, this intelligence would be greater than all of humanity's combined intelligence. And besides these threats, there will still be other threats that will arise as we progress into the future. But there's a good side, because in none of these known cases is there the potential to destroy us 100%. Because thanks to the wide distribution we have in the world, we have geographic protection against extinction. So even if 99% of humans were wiped out in some catastrophe, we would still have 80 million people. And that's a vastly greater number than we've had for most of our 300,000-year history. It's a number equivalent to what we had during the Greco-Persian Wars, when the Persian Empire invaded Greece. With one difference, we would be in the fourth singularity, that of large-scale automation. So even if we lost most of the technology we have today, and believe me, we would lose almost everything you can imagine, at most, we would return to the standard of living we had at the end of the 18th century. The knowledge from the first singularity, fire, from the second singularity, agriculture, and from the third, writing, can no longer be lost, no matter what happens. The question is the fourth, the Industrial Revolution. We would lose almost everything that came from it, but not everything. We would still have enough knowledge to know about combustion, and as a result, about machines. So we would have the population of 500 before Christ, but with the technology of the late 18th century. I can't even imagine the difficulties this population would face, but even so, what matters to us is that humanity wouldn't be extinct, and most importantly, wouldn't have to start over from scratch. Actually, the last time we saw a disaster of this magnitude was with the Black Death in the 14th century, where 10% of the population died and a third of the population in Europe. But even so, we managed to survive, and during the Reconstruction period we had a huge technological and population boom. But then how big of a blow could humanity withstand? And the answer is that our minimum is between 100 and 5,000 people to be able to successfully repopulate the Earth. But below that, this limit would be extremely tight, and we would probably never recover again. So the problem isn't a single catastrophic event, but probably the combination of them, which is what brings us to the main concern of the video, all these problems happening simultaneously. In 2009, two researchers conducted an experiment to see what it would take to bring humanity to complete extinction. In phase 1, we have a rapid collapse of the human population due to global war and the collapse of industry and agriculture worldwide. In phase 2, we see the depletion of the remaining natural resources over the next 2 centuries. And phase 3 predicts a downward spiral of ecosystem collapse punctuated by the eruption of a supervolcano that we know will explode at some point in the next 1,000 years, which would leave the last human groups unable to survive any longer. And before you comment that the supervolcano would eventually lead humanity to extinction one way or another, the answer is no. It would cause damage and deaths on a biblical scale, but we could eventually survive since we would have the infrastructure, industry, and technology to overcome the challenges that would come from it. The problem is if those things I mentioned had already been destroyed before this mega event. So all the data and information indicate that this would be our great filter, the limit of the human race that would then disappear into the sands of time in the universe. I don't know what will happen, but what I do know is that this transition phase we're starting to see will be the most critical transition phase in the history of human civilization, because it will be all the crises erupting together triggered by the demographic crisis. And it amazes me how there are still so few leaders in the world giving importance to this. And in fact, the great filter theory seems more evident in the next 4 or 5 decades than we could have imagined. Because in fact, all these crises hitting us at the same time shows that either we won't make it through this bottleneck of the great filter and will become a species on the verge of extinction, whether gradually or quickly. Or given our experience and technological innovation, we will be on the path to truly becoming a perpetual and interplanetary species. And if that's the case, and we manage to make our civilization, which, if we consider it as having started with the first singularity, the discovery of fire, about 300,000 years ago, exist for 1 million, 5 million, or even more millions of years, then in reality, we would just be witnessing the end of our childhood, where all of this was just the beginning of our story. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share the video with everyone you know, and join our Instagram and Telegram networks to stay up to date with the channel's news. Hugs and see you in the next video.